Why does relationship satisfaction drop for both partners after having children?
And you have these women who feel like, why did I give all of that up? Because now my kids are out of the house and now I don't have a career to go back to, right?
Why, even when dads are doing more than our fathers ever did, does it still feel like it's not enough?
I think men are looking backwards and they're saying like, my mom is saying that I'm an amazing dad, right? And their wives are saying, I am drowning. Don't you see how much more I am doing than you? And both of those perspectives are actually right.
What do we believe the job of a mum is? What do we believe the job of a dad is?
And that's where I see the should, is that these men are saying, what I know how to do is go to work. What I can do is go to work more. I can just work more hours.
Can ideas around masculinity actually help me as a father, or are they things I should be fighting against?
I think it's about transforming the language of being a provider and being a protector to say, it can also be about protecting your time and your sanity. It can also be about providing you space to pursue your dreams.
Where did these ideas come from? And what happens to our relationships when we try to live up to ideals that were never designed for the lives we're living now?
That's just part of the reality of, as I said, office life being set up with this idea that somebody has a stay-at-home wife, which is just not the reality anymore, right?
In this podcast, I talk to authors, academics, sociologists, gender experts, and parenting experts to understand what's really happening to couples after they have children and find out if there is a way to be a happier parent. Corinne Low's book, Having It All, is an investigation into the invisible forces that shape women's careers. We talk behavioral economics and why mothers make the decisions they make. We talk about the evolution of parenting roles and how we've ended up living in a working world which doesn't match our family structures. We talk about deals and whether or not my wife got a good one when she decided to have kids with me. We talk about same-sex relationships and which problems went away when Corinne had her second child with a woman and which ones did not. I hope you enjoy this episode. I want to start with a scenario that I think is quite common. Okay, so my wife and I got married and she was a big earner, very successful. We had kids and she quit that job because there was too much travel and that didn't fit. And for loads of my mates, there's some version of this. Didn't want to go back full time, didn't want to put the child in childcare, wanted to be with the child, never returned fully to work, never gone up for the promotion because doesn't want time away from the house. And then there seems to be this moment further down the line where the woman, the mum, is like, I can't believe this has happened to me. And from the male perspective, it's like, well, this looks very much like you've made a series of choices that if I made them, the consequences would be obvious to my career. Like, what is that missing?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think that is a lot of where the book was coming from, was writing to those women and explaining how these choices that feel like our decision, right, can be made by these invisible forces that are constraining our choices. And those are biology, those are evolution, those are, society and the way it fails to support us. So I say in the beginning, that people like to poo-poo the gender wage gap by being like, well, that's a product of women's choices, but without looking at the forces that are constraining and shaping and forcing those choices, right? And so, when women are saying, well, I needed to make this change in my career to be there for my kids the way I wanted to be, right? What we should be seeing is oh, this is a corporate standard that is forcing that choice because there's no way to actually show up as the parent that you want to show up and have the high-powered career, right? We should be seeing that in relationships, so often, no matter who is the higher earner, right? The wife, the mom, often is the one who gives birth to the child. If it's a biological child, so gives birth to the child, goes through this physical transformation where evolution is screaming at you, millions of years of evolution versus your, the one time you read Lean In, right, is screaming at you. feed this baby, take care of this baby, do not let this baby die, do not leave this baby behind. And that puts us in a different state of decision making during that time. And it's this short term focused time of it feels like an emergency. It feels like life or death because that's what our genes are telling us, because our genes evolved in a time when it was literally life or death. If you didn't do everything you could to take care of your baby was not going to survive, right? And therefore your genes were not going to survive. And so evolution is going to select for focusing in during that period on whatever you need to do to make that baby survive. And then suddenly you zoom out from that period and you realize that because of how the corporate world works, because there's a lot more one way exits than there are on ramps, right? That these decisions that you made to get through this temporary period are now having permanent repercussions on your career. And one of the ways I like to get, men or, corporate leaders to understand that it's structural is by referring to this study that tracked men and women after they graduated from a prestigious MBA program. And what they showed is that immediately after graduating, there was not a very large gender wage gap. And so there is where you might expect to see, like, oh, different choices, different preferences, they're going into different fields. But there was not a very large gender wage gap immediately after graduating. But when they looked a dozen years after graduating, women's curves, their earnings curves leveled off. And this wasn't just true for sort of the average woman. This was true for the 90th percentile of women. So that's that top 10% of women, the 90th percentile. Their earnings a dozen years after getting an MBA were the same as the male mean, or the same as the average man. And what that tells me is that leaning in is not enough. Individual optimization is not enough because that top 10% of women, those are the women who leaned in. Those are the women who prioritized their career. And yet they still were facing structural barriers that meant they did not reap the same financial rewards in their career as men did.
It feels like there's almost 2 points there, right? What are they 2 points? One is that there's this draw for women to be with young children that is not the same as the draw for men. And yes, we all love our children, but I've definitely never felt guilt for going to work, like in the way that my wife has, whether that be biological or sociological. It doesn't really matter. I've never felt bad about going for work. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So we've got that going on. And then are you saying that it's actually a separate issue, is that actually women know that regardless of if they were making really quite brutal decisions in that period, they wouldn't be getting the rewards. So they're even more inclined to be like, no, where I make a difference is with the child.
Yeah, well, I think let's revisit both of those points. So, on the first one, I'm so glad that you said it because part of what the book says that I think is really like a bit bold and rubs some people the wrong way is that I just say that I think women react differently to having a child than men do. And this is something that's almost become kind of taboo to say, but I refer to exactly that, how when I had my first son, every time I had to leave for work, I was racked with guilt. Every time I went on a business trip, it was this, giant existential crisis. And I just have never seen one of my male colleagues experience that, right? And so just naming that and saying, like, okay, of course, because this is the evolutionary strategy and this is the societal strategy, is that for you, by going to work, you said, I viewed it as this is what I'm supposed to be doing. You are confirming the gender norm when you go to work, and women are violating the gender norm. And that gender norm comes both from society, what's expected from us, and it comes from deep down in our genes. And I go into this, the evolutionary biology of it a little bit in the book, but basically that, women have a different survival strategy of trying to make sure each offspring survives, and they do that through care and love. And for men, it's about this economic competition, which used to be going out and slaying the ox or whatever, right? But now is going out and landing the
Ox is
deal.
domesticated. You can't slay an ox. That is out of
Okay,
order.
sorry.
It's like tied to a
The
post.
wild boar. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, like I'm so glad that you named that, and I think that it is very real. And I think the issue is, and I talk about this in the book for women, is like really figuring out how to separate ourselves from our biology a little bit to understand that some of that draw that has made some of my friends like make themselves sick over needing to pump breast milk rather than give their baby, an ounce of formula, that some of that pull is what economists would call irrational. Irrational in the sense that when you zoom out and when you kind of have some distance from it, you'd be like, no, I was crazy to do that. Because that's you also, right? That's also your preferences. But our preferences in each moment are affected by these sort of short-term concerns that shape our biology that don't shape our kind of long-term well-being. But then the second thing I want to note is, yes, even if a woman makes all the same choices as a man, there are these structural constraints. And one way that I show that in the book is referring to this great study out of Sweden, where they have actually like quite good maternity leave. They have, a lot of policies that like in the US we'd be really happy to have. But what these authors show is that women who never have kids, get promoted less than their male colleagues until they hit age 40, at which point they start getting promoted at the same rate. What's going on there is that the bosses are saying, well, why would I make you a manager when you're going to take maternity leave, which in Sweden is at least a year? You're going to be gone for a year. It's going to be super disruptive to my business. So I'm going to let you stay in this junior position until after you've had your kids. And then when she hits 40, he's like, oh, okay, I guess I can give you the promotion. I guess you're not going to have kids. And so that shows us in the data that, even if, as you said, women make all the right choices in terms of their career, that there's still forces that they're facing that are still going to hold them back. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily what's happening for the women who are in the 90th percentile. Some of those women do have kids. And what's happening there is, as I'm saying, they are the 90th percentile. They're the top 10%. And structurally, by nature of being married to a man, being the one who gives birth to a child, right? They are just going to encounter more constraints on their earning power than a man is. And so then within the relationship, that does start to at some point feel unfair because you started out as equals, as intellectual equals. And so for women, it's almost like this burden of being able to do in our knowledge-based economy, being able to do the same things that men can do in the labor force, right? But having this extra ability, which in my economic research I call reproductive capital, this ability to be the one who gives birth to and feeds a child, which means that even if we're equals to men in the workplace, we often don't end up equals within our marriage because one of us has an advantage in being the one to stay home and to care for the child more. And so that, like, why does it feel unfair? It feels unfair because you're like, I know I've never been as smart as you, dude. Like, I know that we graduated from the same college or we got the same PhD or we got the same MBA. Why are you earning more than me? And how could you not end up resenting the systems that make things turn out that way, even when you wouldn't take back any of those moments that you spent with your kid either?
Looking at the whole piece of what you said, the reason that affects relationships, I think, the resentment that comes up is really a lot of what you're saying is when we look at other people, we always see them doing what they want. Whereas actually most of the time we're doing what we feel we should.
Mhm.
And then those two things have a complicated relationship, right? It's like, do I want to work? Yeah, I want to work, but I felt like I should. Like, do I want to be working now? No, but I should. Like, I'm not allowed to not have a job. Like, it's really complicated because we feel good when we're doing the things we should as well. So then we
Yeah.
feel like we want them. But when we look at other people, it just looks like that everyone's doing what they want.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I like what you said about this, what we should be doing. I have deep compassion also for the men who, I talked about the biological piece, which is like the piece where I think I understand why women take more maternity leave. I understand why, it doesn't make sense for the parent who's not breastfeeding to be the one at home and the parent who's breastfeeding to be the one at work, needing to pump 8,000 times a day because like babies eat like 12 times a day when they first come out. Right. Um, but what I see in the data also is that when it comes to things that are not biologically driven, when it comes to cooking and cleaning, that women also do more and they do more even when they're the primary breadwinner, right? And there, That's where I see this pull of the should. Because I'll give you an example that in our data, one thing that people said to us is they said, well, maybe part of the problem is men have to work 40 hours a week. And because they're in jobs that don't have the flexibility and you have to work these sort of minimum hours, so they can't adjust their hours, whereas women have more access to part time work. So we looked at couples where both couples were hourly wage workers. So picture the modal couple here is like she's in healthcare and he's in transportation. So she's a nurse, he's an Uber driver. And in those couples, when her hourly wage was more than twice his hourly wage, she still did double the cooking and cleaning that he did. Okay. But he still worked more hours than she did. And that's where I see the should, is that these men are saying, what I know how to do is go to work. And so even though I see that like I'm not contributing as much as I want to be at home because my wife is earning more, what I can do is go to work more. I can just work more hours. And remember, these are fields where you choose how many hours you work. So he's just continuing to go and work more hours because that's the should. That's the message from society and maybe some of that evolutionary programming too, instead of recognizing, oh, the way I could provide for my family is that if I could pick the kids up from daycare and she could pick up a shift as a nurse, actually, I would be bringing income into the family by enabling my wife to work more, right? And so there are
Yeah,
some places where we,
I don't feel, I was really, really lucky with my job where I got to do the school run. I got to do all this stuff. I, I don't, like, I couldn't relax into it a lot of the time because it felt like I was doing this thing because I didn't have a big enough job that demanded that I wasn't there. And that's what's going on there. It's like, this is slightly uncomfortable. Well, I'm going to double down and be a good man and work harder, even when that's
yeah,
a completely irrational use of time.
yeah, because you were violating the societal gender
You
norm.
can be mean and say that's fragile male ego, but it's an invisible pull that we need to name, right?
Absolutely. And I think that by naming it, right? That's how we're going to kind of learn to transcend it, is by naming that like this isn't men being lazy because we see them putting in the hours at work, right? But it's societal programming that says that the only way he can contribute at work and the only way she can contribute is at home. And then, fighting this fact that, she's going to feel the weight and the burden of what goes on at home in a way that he doesn't feel, but he's going to feel society's judgment of, am I, as you said, do I have a big enough job? Am I, producing enough at work? Am I succeeding enough? And we all need to learn to redefine success to actually have like the lives that we want.
Yeah, and I've got a really, really nice guy that I really like. He's in his 60s, and he made some comment the other day, and I was like, "Oh no, to be honest, mate, I'm pretty active at home, and I do this, this, this." And he was like, "Do you have a penny?" It's an idea that we've all internalized about the domestic sphere being the female sphere, women as well as men, right? That's
Yeah.
the should. It's like this is my wife says when I mess up stuff at home, she still feels guilty because she's like, even if
She's
it was his
responsible for it.
job,
She's in charge.
I should have been doing it, right?
Mhm.
Why? Where does that come from? Like, and why is it so hard to shift now in 2026 when women are working just as hard as men?
Well, I don't think we did any work on gender roles, actually. What happened is that women entered the labor force, in part out of necessity, in part because there was this divorce revolution that meant that the women who had chosen the other route, who had specialized in home production and specialized in investing in their children, they ended up divorced and starting over in their 40s with minimum wage jobs. And so they got this lesson that was like, we've got to protect ourselves and we've got to be able to support ourselves. So they enter the labor force en masse, and we
So
see women's
just
time.
can we just pause there for 1 second and just slow that down? Because this actually was brand new to me. Okay, because I'd always seen the move of women into the workforce as this women's liberation, pure
Yeah.
carrot, right? It's just like, oh, look, there's financial freedom, there's
Yeah.
status, there's me doing a job that's individualized to my needs rather than housekeeping and looking after
Yeah.
children, which is identical for all people. Like I get to be
Yeah.
myself somewhere. But actually what you say in your book is there was a big stick.
Yeah.
Just sorry, explain that again. It's a bit more slowly for the
Yeah,
non-economists.
absolutely. So marriage in the 1950s, because prior to that time, like we were agrarian economies, and so both people are sort of working to like manage, the farm economy, right? As the population urbanizes, we settled into this arrangement of economic specialization, which was that one person specialized in the labor market, one person specialized in home production. And that's the 1950s housewives in the aprons, or is that pennies in British speak? So yes, that's that image we have in our mind of, right, the housewife, taking the turkey out of the oven with her oven mitts, and the dad coming home and making a martini or whatever. So that during that time, right, women are not working in the market, they're working at home, and this is specialization. But at the time, marriage was a very secure contract. So what that meant was you were going to be financially taken care of in retirement, for example, even if you didn't earn any money, because your spouse's spoils in the labor market were going to be divided, shared with you the same way everything you're producing at home is obviously shared with him. And in a way, you can see those investments at home as actually investments in his career, because by not needing to worry about whether his suit is pressed or what he's having for dinner, he gets to spend all of that time at work, which is in fact how we developed some of these work all the time, always available, always on cultures that are now biting us all in the butt, because now all of us are taking on caregiving labor, right? And yet we've developed this work culture that depended on one person taking care of everything at home. So when people tell me like, it's just so hard to adult, I don't know when supposed to go to the doctor, when I'm supposed to take the car in. It's like, because that actually used to be somebody's full-time job. And we developed our work system in a world where somebody was taking care of all of that. Then starting in the 1960s, the late 1960s into the 1970s, in both the UK and the US and many other countries, there's these major divorce reforms. And these reforms are made for ostensibly feminist reasons, right? They're saying they're court cases where, for example, a woman's in an abusive relationship. She needs to be able to walk away from that relationship. And you don't want to have to get your husband's agreement to leave an abusive relationship. Divorce law changes to say anybody, either party, can walk away at any time. You don't have to prove the other person had an affair. There doesn't have to be some, big reason, right? You can just decide, I want to leave the marriage. But the problem with that is that some of the men said, oh, well, I want to leave the marriage and marry my secretary. It's not because anybody's abusive. It's just because the grass looks greener on the other side. And so you had women like my grandmother, for example, who had invested in this domestic production. That's all that they knew. They had given up their jobs. Many of them worked before they got married, but they had given up their jobs. They didn't have careers, and they ended up very poor because they did not have a way to support themselves. And whatever you get in divorce is not going to make up for sharing somebody else's salary, sharing somebody else's retirement, their pension, right? And they don't have that because they invested in the kids in the home. So those women sent a message to their daughters and their nieces, right? And said, do not let this happen to you. And so what we see is that women entering the labor force follows very closely when these more liberal divorce laws were rolled out across in the United States. We can see it kind of state by state, but there was a big reform in the UK in 1969, I think. So what I say is that part of women entering the labor force was really about the bottom falling out of the marriage economy, which means we never dealt with actually changing gender roles. Women changed gender roles. They had to learn how to show up at work and be equals, and they changed the workplace, right? They transformed it in really fundamental ways. And that's all the sexual harassment, lawsuits and legislation that happens, where the workplace, it really changes, but the domestic sphere doesn't. And so women end up, what I say, winning the bread and baking it too, because there was no pressure on men that said, oh, you need to survive at home, right? And so that meant that gender roles and gender expectations for men didn't change. Their way of feeling successful didn't change. And so we really haven't dealt with how do you have a gender structure that supports a two-earner household, even though now our households often have become very dependent on two incomes. And, many couples would say, no, we could not afford for my wife to quit her job.
Most would say that, the majority. This is a bit of a curveball, but I just wonder if we look right at the carrot and the stick, right, that moves women into the workplace. Okay, there is this desire for autonomy and
Mm-hmm.
status of work, and using my individual skills. And then you've got the stick of actually, I'm in a perilous situation without it. What would the mirror of those be that gets men to start to think of the home as a business that they can get? I don't know. Yeah, you understand what I'm saying. What's the pitch for men?
Well, I think the force that is going, if anything is going to change this, I think the force that's going to change this is the falling marriage and fertility rate. Because not all men right now have the earning power where they can be the sole breadwinner and, try to have the traditional household structure, right? Those men who do not have that earning power are finding it very difficult on the marriage market. And that's what we're seeing is lower marriage rates for men who are on the lower end of the earning spectrum. And men say in surveys that the most important thing for them, in fact, to feel successful is to get married and to have children. That is something that's very important to them.
As
And
in that does that comment outweigh women saying that?
yes, yes. If
Wow,
young
that's
men saying that
huge.
say this at a much higher rate than women say it. And so if that's what men want, then they have to figure out what women want, right? Because you cannot have children without women. And this is part of that asymmetric biology that actually, if women want to have children, they can pursue single motherhood, right? It's actually pretty inexpensive for a woman to pursue single motherhood, but men cannot have children without women. In fact, for two gay men to try to have a child, they have to be very, very wealthy because it costs about $200,000 between surrogacy and egg donation because women's role in reproduction is so critical. So for men to have have families, get married, have children, they need to figure out how to show up as partners and bring more than just a paycheck to the table. And so I think if we can change the language of how we talk about this, and instead of feeding these young men resentment and anger at women, right, saying, you need to show up as a partner, and there's so much more that you can do in a household than just bring your paycheck. And the more you're able to demonstrate those capabilities, the more you're going to be able to find this partnership where you're going to be able to have a family. I think that that's the force that might finally start changing things at home.
I'm having such a hard time envisaging how we make it look sexy. Right? If you think, right, there's this series over in this country. I don't think it's big over there, but it's called the Transporter series. And the basic thing is it's car chases and blah 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 blah. It's all very sort of macho, but in every one he gets a woman and he has to protect her and get her somewhere. And basically what they found out that actually sales to these movies were driven by women. And there
Mm,
is still this kind of man as protector thing, which
yeah.
women like the world is more dangerous for women because of men, right? But like the man as protector is still important. And then there is still this kind of mainstream thing about the bloke where he's not wearing a pinny. And like, I find it sounds like you're absolutely right. I'm just wondering, like, what does that
Yeah.
look like?
Well, one of the things that, like, I know you have a lot of male listeners, and I'm sure you've had this conversation with your male friends, right? Is that in terms of things actually being sexy in a marriage, right? One of the prerequisites for that to happen is for women to not feel like they're drowning, right? For women to feel like they're getting their needs met and to not feel like everything is on their plate domestically. And so I have that message to women too, is that I'm saying, like, stop looking for like like testosterone, masculinity, like all of that, right? Because nobody is sexy when you're cleaning their toothpaste off of the bathroom sink. And so you've got to be looking for the things that make somebody, a real partner, because that's actually what's going to keep the spark alive more long term than some of that initial chemical attraction. But we are swimming upstream of evolution there, right? Where, women's genes are selected to look for that male protector because you're in this very dangerous environment, right? The environment in which our genes evolved is very dangerous. So you are looking for that. And so I do think we have to kind of fight those instincts a little bit. But I think it's about transforming the language of being a provider and being a protector to say, it can also be about protecting your time and your sanity. It can also be about providing you space to pursue your dreams and seeing that actually in the long term, that's what's going to keep the romance alive much more than those very short lived, Jason Statham movies, right? Where he
You have
saves
seen
the
it, right?
damsel in distress.
Yeah,
Like it's always a
yeah.
different woman, notice, in the next movie. So,
Yeah, no, he's incapable. The transporter is incapable of sustaining a long-term relationship. It's
yeah.
right there.
Yeah. Mm.
Okay, so let's talk then about how, you know, the role of father has undeniably transformed.
Yeah.
Okay, massively.
Yeah.
My dad is sort of baffled by me and my brothers and everything we do.
Yeah.
And my mum is kind of like, constantly doing this thing to my wife with like, oh, you're so lucky, which, as you can imagine, my wife fucking loves, right? She's like, he doesn't do enough. So, what, like, why isn't that enough?
Yeah.
The extra that we're
This
doing.
Well, first, yes, this is true. Parents spend twice as much time with our kids as a generation ago, and this is true for dads. And so, as I said, the structures that we evolved of like in the workplace that say one person can be always on, it doesn't work nowadays for men either because men are involved as parents. What's interesting though is that because in the background, creating that change was not a shift in gender roles, but rather a shift in the returns to our time with our children, what economists call human capital investment. So, starting in the 1990s, we see this massive increase in parents' time with their children, and it's both men and women. And so, for men, a doubling of your time might mean going from 2 to 4 hours a week. You compare to your dad, and you're like, I am doing so much more. I read my kid a bedtime story, I dropped him off at daycare. My dad never did that, right? But for your wife, whose time is also doubled, that means going from 7 to 14 hours a week. So, the gender gap in time at home has actually gotten wider instead of narrower even though men have increased so massively. And so that's a hard pill to swallow, and I think it's where a lot of misunderstandings in relationships come from because I think men are looking backwards and they're saying like, "My mom is saying that I'm an amazing dad," right? And their wives are saying, I am drowning. Don't you see how much more I am doing than you? They are making the comparison, versus their husband and saying, don't you see how much more I'm doing? And both of those perspectives are actually right. And so I think knowing that data is really important for both people to know. And I have the charts in my book, but that we've just increased the time we spend with our kids enormously. And it comes from a lot of different forces. It comes from us just understanding child development in a way that our parents did not. So, that they thought it was perfectly fine to put the baby in the bassinet and hand them a bottle and go read a book. Um, and us understanding that no, you have to hold your baby, you have to sit on the floor with your toddler, you have to do the homework with your grade schooler. And it's come from the structure of our society changing where we don't feel like it's safe for kids to play outdoors and we don't let them be unsupervised and we don't have communities that support us. Generations have gotten stretched out, so we don't have intergenerational households that can, help us take care of our kids. In fact, our parents often need care at the same time as our kids need care. And it's social inequality in our economy that says, look, there's only so many spots at Harvard or at Cambridge. And so we each have to try to jam as much human capital into our kids as possible because we know getting one of those scarce spots transforms you to have a very different lifestyle because now we have this very unequal economy where if you're a wage laborer, you're not going to have the white picket fence. You're not going to own a home. You're not going to be able to have some of those dreams. And so to get our children their dreams, we're trying to get them into that top rung on the socioeconomic ladder. So it's all of those forces acting on us. I mean, parents are spending a massive amount more time than a generation before. And so while dads feel like they are doing so much, their wives feel like they're drowning. And I think understanding that difference in perspective is going to be the key actually to saving a lot of marriages.
I just want to, like, it's so well explained, this idea that we suddenly understand human capital in a different way, that our children require investment from a very young age. We used to just keep them
Yeah.
alive, and now
Yeah.
I think I've said this before, but
Yes.
parenting only became a verb
Yes.
in the 70s, well, in the
Yeah.
50s, but only
Yeah.
started widely used in the 70s. And what 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 I haven't heard before is that economic argument. Actually, a lot of this is a feature of polarization of wealth.
Mhm.
So now the difference between the haves and have-nots is a lot more
Yeah.
panicky.
Yeah.
You're like, I do not, my kid can't be on that side. That doesn't look like a good
Yeah.
life. They've got to be on this side. I, I'm just interested in your personal opinion. Have we got that right? Like, is that anxiety, as an economist, is that well founded?
I think there is something real in our economy about this sort of need to kind of get ahead, right? I think that what we miss is that sometimes the more that we try to jam into our kid, it's counterproductive because what we see in a lot of kids, I'm a university educator, so I see these kids. What we see in a lot of kids today is that they have anxiety and mental health issues because of all this kind of stress that's been placed upon them. And a lot of them haven't gotten to have the real childhoods that like we had of biking outside, until the sun went down. They didn't get to have the play in their lives and the playfulness because of that focus on human capital development. So I think on an individual parental level, I see the rational decision, but as a society, I think it's sort of a deeply broken model of actually raising kids and raising human beings. So I think for parents, they have to be really strategic about their choices. And that means really letting go of the social pressure that says, well, like Johnny is on 3 travel sports. So now my kid wants to be on 3 travel sports or whatever. And recognizing that letting our kids play, letting them be bored sometimes, letting them navigate social relationships on their own, letting them navigate homework difficulties on their own, having some more of that independence that we had when we were kids, that's okay. But one of the things I advocate for, and this is certainly true in the US, there's some of it in the UK, is that for parents to do less, we need our government to do more. We need society to do more. So the reason I can't let my kid bike outside at all hours is because we're at a 40-year high for automobile deaths, for pedestrian deaths in the US, because car hoods are, now 6 feet high, which means if they hit a child, that child is not going to survive, right? And this lack of regulation directly translates into parents then needing to make themselves crazy. Similarly, if we can't trust our public health authorities, now I have to drive myself nuts doing all this research and trying to understand how do I keep my child safe. And so, I don't want to just put this on parents because I think these are societal choices that have made everything be about the individual responsibility. And it is too much. It is overwhelming. And I want to encourage parents who are listening to really figure out how they can radically prioritize the relationship with your child and your own sanity. Because when you are so stressed out that everything feels like you're drowning, you can't parent your child in the way that's actually nurturing their inner self, which is actually so much the most important form of human capital, so much more important than those sports or those enrichment activities.
I'm going to put some of that back on parents, because I think that may be true in the States about the cars, but I think we have to challenge our anxiety. And there's something culturally where the parents who worry the most are the best
Yeah.
parents. And there's a sort of competitive worrying. And I think it's really hard to challenge those anxieties that my child is going to get snatched by a paedophile, even though the chances of that happening are
Very
less
low.
than her being struck by
Yeah.
lightning. Like, but that's got to come a bit from us. You can't just expect people to make the world safer and safer and
Yeah.
safer.
No, it's very true. And I think that like parents learning to, focus on what actually matters, which is the relationship with your child. And ultimately at the root of the relationship is also your own well-being. And so, I learned that lesson for myself the hard way. Like when I had my first child, I was so stressed out. I was so overwhelmed. I had a 2.5 hour commute. You can read all about it in the book, but I was just constantly in survival mode. And when I made choices that helped me be okay, which felt selfish at the time, I saw my relationship with my son blossom. I actually saw that I could be
Mm.
such a better parent by putting on my own oxygen mask first, right? There's a reason that that's a rule. and that mattered so much more than all of the other things I was making myself crazy trying to provide for him.
I mean, it's so fascinating reading that stuff as a dad,
Mm.
because we obviously were told, you should put your children before yourself, but there's nothing like the kind of guilt that mums feel about when they think of themselves at
Yeah.
all. Like, I'm still supposed to care about my kind of individual achievements and my
Right.
time and all that. Of course I am. It's just like, I'm not going to have a miserable life just to do that. Like,
Yeah.
so my child has this. It's not the same for mums. It really isn't that pressure.
Yeah, no, you're so right. I mean, I tell the story in the book, and it's one everybody always sticks with them about the dad who says that he, goes for a swim for an hour every day, and his wife says she hasn't been for a run in 4 years since her son was born. And so just that, as you said, that ability to have that lens that says, of course, my own needs matter versus completely losing sight of that. And that's so important. And then again, that's another way for dads to be a protector and a provider is like protecting your wife's mental health, is
Mm,
actually telling her, like, I
mm.
see you making this choice to put our kids first, but it's actually not working for you. So we have to reevaluate as a family because your needs matter too. And like sometimes you might actually need to be that voice because the forces of society and the forces of evolution, might be pushing her in a direction that actually is not in her own best interest or ultimately the family's best interest. Because, when mom is so stressed out that she's not getting her needs met, then the household becomes stressed out.
If you be totally honest, right? If you repeat what you just said back to yourself and it's in your former husband's voice, are you able to go, oh, okay,
Yeah.
no, I shouldn't do that?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, let's
that feels like the beginning of an
no,
argument to
well, you know
me.
what? No, let's get into that story a little bit because I do think that so my own story is that, I was living in New York City, commuting to my job in Philadelphia, which is 2.5 hours away. And the reason I was doing this is because I had a step kid, and we also needed to be close to mom, who my stepkid saw on weekends. And so we were trying to optimize for what made life work for my stepkid. And so I was doing this commute, even though I was on the tenure track at Wharton. And then I had a baby, and that started feeling impossible because I was also the breastfeeding parent. And so I saw other people commuting, but it was never the breastfeeding parent, right, on the train. So trying to pump in the Amtrak bathroom, and I was crying. And then at a certain point, my stepkid actually came to live with us full time. So wasn't seeing mom anymore. But then it was, oh, but we can't move because, because of their mental health. We need to actually stay in the same school, right? And so every choice that we made was a choice that I made to say, this is what works for my family. But it was not working for me. It was not working for my career. I was
Mm,
like, it was impossible for me to get any work done. I was on the tenure track at Wharton, and I was our family's breadwinner and at some point sole breadwinner, right? And so I do look back on that and say that I needed somebody to say, whoa, 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 whoa. You're the only person
mm,
who's making huge sacrifices here to make things add up for our family. We have to make things work for everybody. We've got to figure something else out, right? And I think when I look back at it with distance, and I can look back at it through the lens of compassion, because my ex-husband was starting a business, and I think he had this tunnel vision on, I am a failure if I can't get this business off the ground because that's how I've been taught what that means to be successful as a man. And so I've just got to keep putting time into that, even though I realize, or, didn't realize at the time that, my wife is drowning because she's carrying the load at home. She's doing this commute. She's pumping. She's, kind of doing everything. So I think he had tunnel vision on the business. I had tunnel vision on the family's needs. And what that added up to was really me getting pushed beyond my limits. And that I hear you that right about that's the beginning of an argument, but I think stopping and saying, is this working for you? That as a family, we have to
mm,
remember that mom is a member of the household. So if something's not working for mom, it's not working for the household. So actually
mm,
taking that moment to sit down and zoom out and say, in the long term, is this getting you what you need? I know this is what feels like it makes things add up right now, but are there changes that we need to
mm,
make? And I think as a dad, where you'll always be a hero, where it won't start an argument, is if you say, are there sacrifices I need to make in order to make this add up better for you.
That's beautiful. And do you know what that answers? Such a big question I've had, actually, because I think part of the fix that men are in is we're not sure what the sacrifice we're supposed to make anymore is. Like, and everyone wants to sacrifice something, right? Martyr is a horrible slur that gets chucked at women, okay? But really, being someone who adds value through suffering is this really human
Yeah.
need, right? I wanna do something. I wanna lay something down for something bigger, and that's it. Are there any sacrifices I can make that make this easier for all
Yeah.
of us? It's a beautiful question. Having said that, do you want to have an argument?
Yes, I would love to.
So, you have this chapter called Investing in a Partner. And basically in this chapter, you set out a few things that women should be looking for in a partner. I think maybe we should say basically one of the themes of the book is, which is really great, is basically everything is deal. Work is a deal. Your relationship is a deal. You want women to just stop and be like, am I getting a good deal here? Which I think is really great. And this chapter made me a little bit salty because I was like, oh, I wouldn't have passed some of these kind
Yeah.
of tests that you were saying women had to ask. Like, my wife earned loads more than me. There's a bit here. Hang on, I've just written this down somewhere. There are two types of red flags to spot here. One, men who have never thought about what they want their home to look like and are comfortable living in a generic white box. Okay, stop. Right, that is me. That's still me. I don't give a shit. Like, it's just not like, it's just like not my thing. And that's a source of tension in our relationship, right? But it's not been a deal breaker. And I felt like a lot of the stuff that you went through and you were saying, you need a man who's going to do this, and you need a man who's got this kind of experience with children or whatever. I'm like, well, you've just shown me loads of graphs that show that there aren't any men like that, and it's all right for you because you're going to go off and be a lesbian and you can find a woman who can do it. But these men don't exist, as you've proven.
So, yes, I will say I wrote this chapter in part to my younger self that when I originally got married, I didn't think about any of this. I was looking for somebody who checked my boxes as a boyfriend. And I found out later that the person who checks your boxes as a boyfriend, it was like, oh, we have deep philosophical conversations, right? Is not necessarily the same thing that helps support you as a partner, as a husband, as a co parent, right? And so I know I share those questions in my class and I, send the students off at spring break and I'm always like, okay, go have fights with your loved ones. Come back and tell me how it goes. And I often, there are some conversations, some breakups, but pretty few. And so I think that what my goal in sharing it with people with the questions I wish I had known is to have these conversations earlier. And it doesn't mean, that poor Alex doesn't get to get married, right? You get, chucked to the curb. It means that you get this chance to surface the idea that where we are going as a couple is not where we are right now. And maybe we need to think a little bit about how we support each other, where we're going before we get there, before things get hard. So, to have the conversation now, one of the questions I say is, okay, of course you say, baby, of course your career is just as important as mine. But what does it look like when one of our kids is sick and somebody needs to stay home from work? Are you able to swallow that pill despite all of that programming that says you've got to show up at work and you've got to advance your career as much as you can, to be like, actually, it makes sense for me to be the one to stay home today, right? Because I need to sacrifice something to get, to have my wife have the career that she wants also. So having those conversations early and to have the conversation to say, oh, I'm recognizing right now all our furniture is IKEA and crappy, but when I envision a house, I want to live in a house that is furnished and is beautiful and is warm and has places for our children to play and has books and has paintings, right? So if that's what I want, and that's not necessarily what you've ever envisioned, how else can you support that? What are the things that you're going to take on, right? Because I think the goal is you
Hmm.
want to prevent these defaults from just creeping up where all of a sudden you realize there's 100 things to do in the house and 99 of them are on her plate, right? And the things that the men do often at home, what we
Hmm.
see in the data is they do things that are like weekly and monthly and yearly. So they do the gutters and they do, the lawn and they do the car maintenance, but the day-to-day things that need to be done 12 times a day, pick up toys, give the kids a snack, right? We see the women doing that. So I think if you have these conversations early, you prevent getting to a point where that resentment bubbles up because someone feels like they've almost been tricked into taking everything on. And it all made sense because it was all her preferences. She cared more about the house. She cared more about what the kids ate. She cared more about this and she cared more about that, right? But suddenly she realizes that you have gotten to pursue your dreams and she has only gotten to be a mom.
Hmm.
And that's where divorces come from. That was where my divorce came from, right? So I'm going to stave that off for people by bringing these conversations to the foreground early so that you can plan proactively and make your relationship stronger.
And what your book's doing is saying, you're going to feel
Yeah.
like this. And you're going to feel like this. It's like it's going to come out of
Yeah.
nowhere. But just please listen.
Yeah.
Like it feels like there were times it felt like a Chekhov
Yeah.
play, right? It's just like like Chekhov's whole thing is like no one can really listen to anyone, and you're all going to go ahead and make the same
Yep.
mistakes
Yep.
anyway. But but I did think I felt it provoked a really interesting conversation with me and Eloise about like basically Corinne Low says you shouldn't have married me. but like but like, why did you, right? Apart from the fact that you were older than me and you were running out of eggs, like what was kind of in it for you? And I think there's something really interesting that y- a lot of the questions about our values actually, if you're young, your values will probably change. Well, maybe you
Yeah.
would hope they would change actually. But there's something I think in looking for a partner, which I felt was missing, which is basically evidence that that person can have a relationship. And that's kind of like, do you have a group of friends?
Mm-hmm.
What are your relationships like with your siblings and with your
Mm.
parents? Like, if I see so many men who've been in like awful relationships with my female
Yeah.
friends, and it's like
Yeah.
the guy didn't have any mates.
Yeah.
Like, where's his crew? I think that's a really good
Yeah.
sign. Do you know what I mean? That you can have sustained friendships. And equally, women who've fallen out with anyone they've ever known, like that's probably not going to go
Yeah.
well. So that was one of the things that Eloise
Yeah.
said. She was like, "Well, you had this really group of loving
I love
friends.
that.
It's
And
a
I
good
think that
indicator."
shows, right? Because when I'm talking about this, I'm seeing what is he bringing to the table that is going to nourish your future life. And that being able to sustain relationships is huge, right? That's a sign, right? That's a sign of this future growth. It's kind of like the little bud poking out of the soil, when it's spring, which I hope is coming soon. And so I think that's what you're looking for in these conversations. And even by having these quite provocative conversations, what you're finding out is this someone who can have a conversation about this and not be defensive? And someone who can explore,
Mm.
right? Gender roles and,
Yeah.
the meaning of some of these things. And that's what you're finding out. You're finding out, can we grow together?
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, like, yeah, what's the response to trying to have a conversation? Talk to me, right? We just alluded to it out of nowhere before that you then go on to have a lesbian relationship, and so now we've got a direct
Yeah.
comparison. Just tell me, like, what? Obviously, not all men and women are
Yeah.
the same. It's not going to answer the problem for everyone. I'm really interested to know though what problems you feel the gender difference has got rid
Yeah.
of,
Well,
and which ones are still there.
what I will say is when you are in the squeeze, which is the time when you're trying to make career investments and you have young children at the same time, life is hard. And so I had a baby when I was 32 and I had another baby when I was 40 who's now, 9 months old. And both times, one time I was with a man and now I'm married to a woman, both times this has been a very challenging year because it is just hard. Your baby needs so much. And for me, even though at this point I had tenure at my job, I decided to have a book come out the same year I had a baby. And so my job needed a lot from me. And my wife's job needs a lot from
And
her.
go on every single podcast in America and UK.
And so it just is hard, and it what isn't magically replacing, the husband kind of made it easy, right? But the piece that for me, what I was looking for, what actually made me feel like I was only going to consider female partners. Obviously, I had the advantage of being, bisexually attracted, but to say why was I looking for a female partner is it got rid of the defaults. And for me, as someone who had been the breadwinner in my previous relationship, but was still the default parent, right? I saw like during COVID when we had no childcare, all of my male colleagues, their wives took the hit. Their wives were the ones who, made sure that the kid was taken care of because they were on the tenure track at Wharton. Of course they needed the time. But I was on the tenure track at Wharton, right? I needed the time. But there was no assumption like, oh, of course your career should be prioritized. And that was because of my gender, right? That was because I was the woman and he was the man. So even though, he was starting a business, which could have been put on pause, right? It was, hey, his work has to be treated as sacrosanct. So I wanted to get rid of those defaults. And that is true, right? At some point in our relationship, my wife was laid off and she did everything around the house, everything. She took, my son, who's, not her son, who's her stepson. She took him to soccer. She was the soccer mom. Everybody at school and at soccer knew her, instead of me. And because there was no gender default there. And so she was able, and we see that in the data, that in the data, same sex relationships, they are elastic to who is earning more money. When one person gets laid off, that person steps up at home, et cetera. Whereas in a heterosexual relationship, you have those gender defaults. And so that's the piece that you get rid of. And so, in my household right now, I do all the cooking still, but my wife does all the cleaning, right? So again, it's not, instead of dividing along gender lines and instead of it feeling like, oh, I'm cooking because I'm a woman, it's so we can recognize, oh, you care more about the cleaning. I care more about us eating healthy food and I'm good at cooking. So, this is how we're going to divide things up. But there's so much to navigate, and that's just part of the reality of, as I said, office life being set up with this idea that somebody has a stay-at-home wife, which is just not the reality anymore, right? That's not the reality for, the vast majority of workers. And so that makes it really hard in this period of life because your career is not planned around that you actually want to show up and be there for your kids and be involved and that you actually have to be the one to, make your own doctor's appointments because there's no one to make them for you.
This is the part of the book where you say that most homes work on this unvoiced assumption, and it's always
Yeah.
unvoiced. It's something about convex earnings, but that basically like the job where someone puts in the mega
Yeah.
hours then makes a disproportionate amount of mega money, and that it's better to have one person doing that and one person that completely steps back or abandons their career than it is to have two people bobbling along on sort of median salaries. Is that right? Are we getting that right? Does it make economic sense?
Well, I think that economic incentive is there in the modern labor force. And I think it's something that's deeply problematic because what you don't see, that force acts on you and you're like, all right, let's just lean into, the husband's career. And then all of a sudden, you sort of wake up and, you end up with this feeling of somebody hasn't gotten their needs met. Somebody has lost something, right? And you have these women who feel like, why did I give all of that up? Because now my kids are out of the house and now I don't have a career to go back to, right? And so I call that out to say that economic force is there, it's acting on you. But I actually think the more that you can resist it, the more that you can fight it, the better off you'll be in the long term as a household. Because then on the flip side, when it is the woman's career, who's the one who's earning more money, we don't see her getting that same benefit, right? We don't see that when the woman is earning more money, that you have that specialization and, she's able to just solely invest in her career. And so
Right.
I would say that, yes, that economic force is there and naming it helps you understand. You're like, oh, that's why we're like, oh, it makes more sense for, I say in the book, like for, him to make partner rather than, both of us work 40 hours and neither of us make it. Right. But the long-term consequences of somebody giving up her career, if that's not actually where her heart is, if that's not actually where her dreams lie, you know, that can be really damaging. And so, are there ways to get through the squeeze and for both of you to set boundaries at work to say, no, neither of us can give work 120%. Both of us need to give work 70%, right? And be able to have something left over for home.
Let's say the policymakers, the CEOs,
Mhm.
the mums, the dads, they read your book and they take its message to heart. Like, what does the world look like?
Well, I think a big thing is when I talk about these boundaries at work is not having the jobs that expect the 80 hours from you, at some point in your career is, and just understanding that you're going to give something up from that worker in that moment in life. But what you're going to gain is people not burning out, people not leaving their jobs, not bleeding female talent. So if you look at law firms have done a really good job of getting to 50-50 in hiring for entry level associates. And then if you go up to senior partners, it might be, 10% women, right? They just hemorrhage that talent because of what the job asks from you. And so I think for firms to understand that that's expensive, that investing in hiring and training people who you then lose is really expensive. And if you can provide some structure, because it's actually about boundaries, not about flexibility. And I go into more detail in the book. If you can provide that structure that lets people have a life outside of work, you can retain workers through the squeeze. And the squeeze is so temporary that you don't want people to make these kind of permanent decisions, based on this temporary problem. And so if firms can figure out how to support working parents through that period, I think they're going to end up with more of a competitive edge because of the talent that they're able to retain. One of the big things that I think that we get wrong in the messages that we give to women is that all the business books for women are kind of like act more like men, right? It's that women don't ask and nice girls don't get the corner office. And when I look at the data and what the research actually says, it shows that there are places where though there are gender differences, that women's traits might actually be more productive in the workplace. So I give an example from my own research on negotiation where I'd always heard men are better negotiators than women. When I looked at the literature, I actually didn't find studies that showed that. I found studies that showed men negotiate more. I found studies that showed that men were rated as being better negotiators, but nothing showing that they actually got more. So I ran a study where it was an incentivized negotiation. The stakes were real. They actually got paid whatever they got. And you had to negotiate over a $20 bill, and one person got $5 and one person got 15, or vice versa. And you had to agree on that. So obviously that's a pretty fierce negotiation because you both would rather have the $15. And if you can't agree, you both get zero. And what I found is that when men negotiate against women, they were equally likely to get the $15, no difference in performance there. But men got less money in this study, in this negotiation overall. Why? Because when women were paired with other women, they also did just fine. But when men were paired with other men, they were more than twice as likely to fail to reach an agreement and therefore get $0 as any other pair type. And so the men's instincts that were praised of being aggressive negotiators here were actually a terrible fit for how you actually made the most money. Because yes, you ideally want the $15, but you also want to make sure you don't just walk away with zero, right? You want to make sure you get something. And I can see that, in a lot of corporate scenarios as a manager, I would be a lot more worried about blowing up a multi-year, multi-million dollar partnership than I would be about getting the extra 0.001% on the royalty contract. And so some of these traits that we treat as, the ideal in the workplace because they're the masculine traits that have always been there, right? There's no evidence to show that that's actually what's productive. And so I think that diversity of traits in the workplace could actually make us a lot more money if we were able to recognize them as strengths instead of something to be sort of apologized for or changed.
I mean, when I read that bit of the book, and it was like, because basically one guy comes in and was like, look, it's 15-5 my way, otherwise I'm walking out. And I'd be like, if someone said that to me, I'd be like, go fuck yourself. Boom, grenade, which is what every bloke did.
And that's exactly what happened. Yes, that was Matt.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Corinne's book is called Having It All, What Data Tells Us About Women's Lives and How to Get the Most Out of Yours. The book is called Feminomics in the UK. Check out Corinne at CorinneLow.com, and you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Be a Happier Parent and as Alex Trippier on Facebook. Please like and subscribe to the podcast so you can get the next episode when it drops.